Do you believe in ghosts? I didn't either, until that night on the M90 when I saw something that made me question reality. Stay with me until the end because this story will chill your soul. I've always enjoyed driving at night. There's something about the silence of deserted roads that gives me a strange sense of peace. I'm Albert Mitchell, a lorry driver for over 40 years, and on that particular day, I was on my way to Inverness on the M90. The clock struck almost midnight, and the fine, typical October rain was falling unhurriedly, creating ghostly reflections in the puddles scattered across the tarmac. The road was almost deserted, except for the sound of my truck's engine and the irregular whirring of the windscreen wipers. Everything seemed routine, until something on the side of the road caught my eye. It wasn't an animal, nor the twinkling eyes of a curious fox. It was a human figure, small, perhaps a child. I was alarmed, but my logic was quick. Who in their right mind would be walking alone on a road like this, on a night like this? There were no houses around, just a long stretch of dense, dark forest. As I approached, I slowed down, my eyes fixed on the motionless figure. Then it happened. The child, yes, it was definitely a child, took a step towards the road. A single step, as if there was no fear, hesitation, or any notion of imminent danger. My reaction was instinctive. I hit the brakes hard, the wheels screeched against the wet tarmac, and for a moment everything was a blur. The impact was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the noise, that dry, horrible sound, was imprinted on my mind like an indelible mark. My heart raced and my throat instantly went dry. The cab became unbearably hot, suffocating. I almost stumbled out of the lorry, my knees shaking. My torch, which I always kept in the cab, seemed to weigh a ton as I held it up, pointing the flickering beam of light at whatever was on the ground. And there she was, a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her wet hair stuck to her pale face, her clothes dirty with mud and blood. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. For a few seconds, I remained motionless, waiting for her to get up to say something. But she didn't move. I looked around, desperate for help, but there was no one. The world seemed frozen, except for the insistent sound of the rain and the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was then that a terrible idea took shape in my mind. If nobody saw it, nobody knows. The clock seemed to mock me, each second dragging into an eternity as I stood there, paralyzed. The rain now felt heavier, pounding against the truck, as if it wanted to suffocate me. My mind wrestled with a single question: what to do? Each possibility was a labyrinth with no exit. I knew calling the police was the right thing to do, but the fear was a hungry predator. I dragged the girl's body off the road with an almost reverent gentleness, as if she might wake up at any moment and scream. Her weight, light as it was, seemed to crush my soul. Each step in the mud made a sickening, disturbing sound, as if the forest itself was aware of what I was doing. In the middle of the darkness, I found a narrow clearing. It was the perfect place to bury a secret. My hands trembled as I dug with an improvised shovel that I always kept in the back of the truck. With each strike into the ground, the air felt heavier, as if something invisible was watching me, and perhaps it was. When I finished, I looked at the makeshift grave. The earth seemed to writhe, rejecting what I had placed there. A cold wind passed through me, a chill running up my spine, as if the night itself had rebelled against my act. I hurried back to the truck, my steps rushed, not looking back, not allowing my conscience to cling to that sight for another second. On the way back to the road, the words, "No one saw, no one knows," echoed in my mind like a desperate mantra. I started the engine and drove off, trying to convince myself that it would all end there, in that clearing, buried forever, but it didn't end. Less than 20 minutes after returning to the road, something began to change. The dashboard lights, flickered intermittently as if the truck itself was reluctant to continue. In the rear-view mirror, I saw something that froze my blood. A pale silhouette, illuminated only by the tail lights. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. The silence that had once been comforting now felt like a punishment. Every shadow on the road took on grotesque shapes. Every sound turned into an accusing whisper. And then came the laughter. Low, weak, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. It came from inside the cabin. I froze, unable to breathe. My eyes frantically searched for the source of the sound, but there was no one there, just emptiness. Only it was no longer just emptiness. Something was with me, invisible, but real enough to make my heart beat like an uncontrolled drum. With each kilometer I traveled, the feeling worsened. The cabin became smaller, tighter, as if something or someone was stealing the air. The road lights began to fail, flickering in an almost hypnotic rhythm. The radio, which was turned off, crackled with static intermittently, as if a voice was trying to emerge from it. I needed to stop. And when I finally pulled over into an isolated lay-by, I realized I was no longer alone. The truck cabin felt different, almost as if it had a life of its own. The air was heavy, charged with a tension that made me shiver. My fingers gripped the steering wheel as if that could protect me. But from what? The question haunted me, echoing in my mind like an incessant drum. Outside, the road seemed to be drowned in shadows that didn't belong only to the night. The light from the headlights was swallowed by an almost tangible darkness, and the silence was broken only by the insistent dripping of rain on the windscreen. And then it happened again. The laughter, weak, almost mocking, but this time closer, so close that I felt the sound vibrate in my bones. My heart raced as my eyes scanned every corner of the cabin. Nothing, just emptiness, and yet I knew I was no longer alone. Suddenly, the radio came back to life, a deafening hiss filling the space. The voices were there, mixed in the static, whispering words I couldn't fully understand. But there was something, a phrase that repeated like an incessant accusation. You can't run away. The pulsing in my head intensified. I tried to turn off the radio, but the button didn't respond. It was as if something was in control, something I couldn't see, but felt deeply. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my mind. When I opened them, my breath caught. On the fogged-up windscreen, there was something written. Small, almost childlike letters that formed as if an invisible hand was drawing them in the condensation. Why? Just that, a simple question, but one that carried an unbearable weight. My eyes burned. I didn't know if it was from exhaustion, fear, or something deeper. But when I blinked, the words disappeared, leaving only the wet glass and the feeling that I was being watched. I thought about running, getting out of the truck, fleeing to anywhere, but my legs felt like lead. Every part of me was trapped in that suffocating space, as if the cabin had turned into a prison. Suddenly, the dashboard lights flickered again, and the engine roared irregularly, as if something was interfering. And then, in the rear-view mirror, I saw her. It was her, the girl, pale and motionless, looking at me with eyes that seemed empty but at the same time pierced me to the soul. My throat went dry. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare at that ghostly figure that now shared the space with me. And then she moved her lips. I didn't hear words, just a slow movement, almost as if she was enjoying my terror. My whole body trembled. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the impossible was there, right in front of me, and there was no ignoring it. The girl disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, leaving only the echo of my own panic. The radio fell silent, the lights stabilized, and the cabin returned to what seemed like normality. But I knew it wasn't over. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed lighter now, like a distant lament. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. I just drove, focusing on the road ahead, even though my eyes insisted on seeking shadows where there shouldn't be any. The truck's engine seemed to be whispering, a low and irregular noise that made me shiver. It was no longer the sound of a machine, it was almost human. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if that could anchor me to something concrete. I'm going crazy, I thought, repeating the words like a mantra to convince myself that it was all a product of my exhausted mind. But the road wouldn't let me forget. It had changed. The familiar signs had disappeared. The traffic signs were worn, almost illegible, covered by a patina of rust and abandonment. It was as if I had entered a place that time had forgotten, a piece of road that didn't belong to the world I knew. Then the radio crackled again, but this time there were no voices. Just a soft melody, something that sounded like a distorted lullaby. The sound was both comforting and horrifying, a combination that made my stomach churn. An unexpected curve forced me to shift my attention, and my heart almost leapt out of my chest. In the middle of the road, there was something. It looked like a toy, a small teddy bear soaked and lying on the asphalt. I stopped the truck abruptly, the sound of the brakes echoing in the night. I stared at the object, wondering if I was seeing things. But it was there, motionless, like a cruel reminder of what I was trying to forget. Why would I stop? I thought, trying to justify the decision to continue. But something held me back, a feeling that if I didn't face this, what was to come would be even worse. With trembling hands, I opened the truck door. The cold of the night hit me like a blade, cutting into my skin and freezing my bones. Each step towards the toy felt like a test, a challenge I didn't know if I could overcome. When I bent down to pick it up, I felt a presence behind me. It was subtle, like a movement of air that shouldn't be there. The teddy bear was in my hands, heavy with water, but it was what I saw when I looked up that froze my blood. In the shadows at the edge of the road, there were figures. They weren't people, at least not anymore. Their outlines were indistinct, enveloped in a darkness that seemed alive. They didn't move, but I felt their eyes, invisible but undeniable, fixed on me. I ran back to the truck, throwing the teddy bear onto the passenger seat before locking the doors. The engine roared when I turned the key, and I sped down the road without looking back. The road seemed endless. The kilometers passed, but the fear continued to grow, accumulating like a storm about to burst. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was a threat. Then, on the horizon, I saw lights. They were faint, flickering like candles in a distant window, but they were enough to rekindle a nearly forgotten hope. The lights in the distance seemed promising, like a sign of life amidst that unsettling void. However, as I approached, I realized they didn't belong to a village or a petrol station. They were old lanterns, suspended by chains that swayed with the rhythm of the night breeze. Strange and antiquated, like something out of another era. The truck slowed down almost of its own accord, as if it had a will of its own. My instinct told me to keep going, but my curiosity, or perhaps something darker, made me stop. A solitary house emerged from the darkness, its worn structure and windows reflecting the rain like broken mirrors. I hesitated, but the feeling of being watched pushed me out of the vehicle. I didn't know what I expected to find, but something told me I needed to face it. As soon as I took the first steps, I noticed the marks on the ground. Footprints, small, belonging to a child, leading towards the house's door. With my heart racing, I knocked on the door, hoping no one would answer. The sound echoed, followed by a deafening silence. When the door opened on its own, a smell of mold and wet earth hit me. There was no light inside, but I entered anyway, unable to resist. The interior was even stranger than the exterior. The furniture was covered in dust, and the walls displayed old paintings that seemed to follow me with their painted eyes. Everything there seemed out of place, as if it belonged to a forgotten time. Then I saw it, the reflection in the hallway mirror. It was the child. Her empty eyes stared at me, but her face remained motionless, emotionless. She didn't move, but the reflection blinked. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned abruptly, but the hallway was empty. My panic grew, but something made me press on, drawn by a low sound that seemed to come from the back of the house. It was a melody, the same one I had heard on the radio, only clearer now. My legs moved almost against my will, leading me to a slightly open door. Behind it, I found a room. In the center, there was a large mirror, and reflected in it, the child was sitting in a chair, holding the teddy bear I had found on the road. Her lips moved, but no words came out. My scream died in my throat when the mirror began to crack. The fissures spread rapidly like spider webs, until the glass shattered into thousands of pieces, falling to the floor. When I looked again, the room was empty, except for a single message written in the dust on the floor. "You can't run away." I ran back to the truck, feeling a presence behind me with every step. As soon as I got in, I locked the doors and started the engine, pulling away with such force that the wheels spun on the wet asphalt. The lights of the house quickly disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the terror remained, lodged in me like a thorn. I knew I wasn't alone on that road, and that the worst was yet to come. The roar of the engine seemed like the only living thing on that desolate stretch of road. The raindrops drummed on the windscreen, but now they sounded like a clock, marking the time I didn't have. The message on the floor still burned in my mind. "You can't run away." I tried to push the thought away, focusing on the asphalt stretching ahead. But the darkness seemed denser, almost palpable, as if something was shaping it. The melody, that damned melody, returned. Low, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I looked at the radio. It was off. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure on the road. A man with a wide-brimmed hat, holding a cane that reflected the light like liquid silver. He was motionless, but the road didn't allow for swerving. I hit the brakes. The truck skidded, but stopped a few meters away. When I looked up again, the figure had disappeared. A chill ran through my body. I put the truck in gear, but it wouldn't move. The engine was running, but the wheels seemed stuck. Something was wrong. A sound came from the trailer, a rhythmic beating as if someone was inside. I swallowed hard and got out of the vehicle, the rain soaking my clothes in seconds. I walked to the back, trembling with cold and fear. The tarp covering the trailer was torn, but empty. Only the chain that once secured it swung in the air, making that sound. Then I felt it. An invisible weight hovered around me, and the rain seemed to freeze in time. When I turned, he was there, the man with the hat. He didn't speak, just pointed to the road behind me. When I turned again, I saw something that shouldn't be there. The house, with its lanterns swaying. But I was sure it was miles away. "You know it has always been here," the voice came, low and deep, but it wasn't the man's. It was as if the road itself was speaking to me. I ran to the truck, struggling to keep my sanity, but as soon as I got in, I realized the interior was no longer the same. On the passenger seat was the teddy bear, now wet and stained. The words "Welcome to the End" were scrawled on the windscreen, dripping as if made of fresh blood. My body froze, unable to react, until the sound of the melody began to grow. It filled the air, vibrating inside me. The lights of the house lanterns began to move, surrounding the truck, until everything around me was consumed by darkness. That's when I understood. The road never had an end, and I wasn't driving away. from something, but into it. The weight of the silence in the room was almost unbearable. The two sat on the edge of the bed, rigid as statues, while her eyes scanned the ceiling, avoiding direct eye contact with either of them. The frail woman, with pale skin and visible bones beneath her faded nightgown, breathed with difficulty, each breath an effort that seemed to tear pieces from her soul. "I need you to know the truth," she began, her voice hoarse and almost swallowed by the noise of the heart monitor. It all started that night. The girls' parents exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. The mother, with swollen eyes and a rosary in her hands, held her breath. The rain was so heavy that the road disappeared before his eyes. He said he was tired, that maybe he should stop. But the clock, always the damned clock. He was late for a delivery. The words hung heavy in the air. She looked at her own hands, trembling, and continued. He saw something on the side of the road. He thought it was an animal, and when he realized, it was too late. The truck skidded. The sound, that sound, it never left his head. A muffled scream, a crack, and then silence. The girl's father, until then impassive, leaned forward. His eyes full of tears he tried to hold back. He knew what he had done. She nodded slowly, as if each movement consumed all the strength she had left. He got out of the truck, looked, and found. But he didn't call for help. He didn't take her to the hospital. Her voice broke, turning into a painful sob. He put the body in the trailer. He thought no one would know, that he could run away from it. The girl's mother began to cry softly, her hands gripping the rosary so tightly that her fingers turned white. And then, she swallowed hard, the heart monitor briefly accelerating. He was never the same. The road, the rain, the sound of the wheels, it all haunted him. He said he heard children's laughter in the cabin, that he saw figures in the mirror. I thought it was guilt, but it was more than that. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked the father, his voice filled with pain and anger. She lifted her eyes for the first time, looking directly at them. "Because you deserve to know. Because he tried to bury the past, but the past always finds a way to surface. And because deep down, he knew that justice would only come when the truth was told." A deafening silence filled the room. The only thing that moved was the oscillating line on the monitor, marking the irregular rhythm of her heart. "And where is he now?" asked the mother, wiping away her tears. The woman took a deep breath, the effort evident in each word. "He paid the price. The road took him, just as it took your daughter. It was the punishment he deserved." Their eyes widened in confusion. "What do you mean by that?" She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her gaunt face. "He was my husband, and I loved him, but now all that's left is the truth." Their faces turned into masks of shock, the revelation hitting them like a punch to the stomach. The room seemed to darken, the air growing denser. She, however, seemed lighter, as if she had finally freed herself from an unbearable weight. "Hope this brings you peace," she murmured, before her head slumped to the side, the sound of the monitor giving way to a long, continuous beep. In that moment, the truth was finally told. But the cost was greater than anyone there could bear.